What's up, y'all? It's Cousin Chet. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Welcome. Today I'm here with my cousin Julian, who you might recognize from another episode. Julian, how you doing? It's good to see you. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for sitting down with me. And just before I started recording, he was telling me about a previous conversation, and as I asked him about a topic, and so I'm just going to let you pick it up from there. Go ahead and if you want to kind of refresh it.
Awesome.
A little bit.
So, like I said, I was door dashing with my buddy, and we were kind of having a conversation. He grew up really atheistic. He's like a very logistical, things have to make sense kind of person. But recently, he's realized that he absolutely believes in a form of God, not necessarily a Christian or any ideology specifically, but broke it down into kind of like unexplainable events. He was like, there are things that just happen that, are related to God. They are just things that just happen. And I kind of broke them down the way that I believe, and some of the things that we talked about in the last podcast with the source consciousness things and stuff. And there's something that I watched a JRE episode the other day, and I believe it was somebody that you recommended. I'm not totally sure, but he talks about the waking consciousness and the sleeping consciousness, not as if it's a subconscious, but as if it is not active consciousness. And some of the connections that I started to make with him in our free conversation is sleeping consciousness is kind of the barrier. And in constructing my idea, this is what I've decided is your sleeping consciousness is the barrier of protection between your source consciousness and your waking consciousness. So it's bridging the gap almost. Being that when you are in, your subconscious already knows things. Like if you've tried psychedelics, when you take psychedelics, you don't have a path of asking questions. You formulate questions after you receive answers. And it kind of shows that the information is readily available. It's you tap into something that has almost like a memory bank that has information that is absolutely true that a lot of times you can't even take with you. Some of the time it doesn't even make it across the barrier. What's interesting about it is they are just definitive truths a lot of the time. It is a lot of it is related to people who have smoking addiction and want to quit smoking. The reason that this helps, like psilocybin helps with addiction, is that you see definitive truths. You see the definitive truth within your situation. And so it relates. But this isn't because you asked a question or because you went hunting for answers. It's not because you hypothesized and went through a scientific method, which I think is a really interesting idea because we think that information comes from our ability to find it. And that's why we need definitive results. Whereas definitive results come from our source consciousness more often than not. And even in finding definitive results through a scientific method, we see they're already results that we didn't make them results, right? These were definitive ideas prior to us knowing now.
Knowing through a scientific method. So one of those truths, if I'm understanding you, is what you are calling source consciousness right now. Is that what I might call God?
Yes, absolutely.
And so, because you mentioned like this other person that you're talking to, is he atheist or agnostic, or
he grew up atheist. Now he's kind of agnostic, but he still holds a lot of the atheistic ideology. I think that a lot of what has changed him recently is psychedelic use, and you see that a lot in quite a few people. I mean, you even see Mike Tyson is like a totally different human being now after psychedelic use, and so I think it's kind of a box that once you open, it's really hard to contain, and then you start to realize that there are a lot of things that happen that have nothing to do with us that we interpret in a certain way because of our ability to interpret it. And that doesn't come from that doesn't come from us being human and living our experiences. That's the experience of the entire human consciousness.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that the use of psychedelics has taken you to a place where essentially you feel that you've communed with God.
Absolutely.
And therefore you have a knowing instead of a believing.
Correct. Absolutely.
And I don't think you've said this, but I'm just going to kind of follow the thread in my mind right now. So, do you belong to any religion?
Not myself. As I kind of live my life, I've started to develop my own style of beliefs that you could probably identify into a religion.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm definitely very much a free thinker, and what I do is I kind of analyze different things as they come up, like different biblical texts, different theologies, and I kind of try to interpret it in a way with zero bias. Like, I don't want the human effect on it. I don't want from anyone's point of view. I want to see how the situation happened with as much clarity as possible and relate it in a way that I can understand it myself. And I think that's a huge reason why I developed this idea of like source consciousness, is because it creates more of, there's an entity now that you can interface with that isn't necessarily one thing, right? I think people get lost in the idea of God because, and for me, a lot of the time was God in a lot of Abrahamic religions is portrayed as a sentient single being who would have thought of everything, right? And now what I've turned it into is more of a bank of knowledge instead. And so it's not a sentient life being, however, it's compiled of multiple sentient lives. And so another way that I like to break it down for people like my friend who grew up really atheistic or hold more atheistic beliefs is even down to a genetic level. So the way that I would think about it is that if you wanted to personify God, it would be the first iterance of an intelligent form, right? Of consciousness. And so our connection to consciousness is directly aligned with our ability to be human. It's our human consciousness. And so as we become of our parents, like a tree, we become of our parents, you have a different connection to consciousness because your consciousness is shaped by all of the previous experiences. So you still have to filter through those before you get to, well, I guess it's layers, because everyone is developing source consciousness, right? Every experience that we have is the human consciousness mapping our existence, right? Mm-hmm. This is why we have, extreme scientific discoveries. The reason that we even care for that, the reason that we care for where we come from, the reason that we care to know things is because consciousness itself is a very living entity itself, right? And so we learn and know things from our previous generations. However, the way that you are as a human being also reflects exactly the life that your parents lived, and their lives directly reflect the lives that their parents lived. And it goes in multiple directions, obviously. I think that obviously their experiences are directly genetically bound to you in one way. But then obviously their parenting strategies and their treatment of you is also developing your consciousness. But that's developing your human consciousness. Mm-hmm. Your subconsciousness, in my idea of this, is going to be primarily formed from the previous experiences of your parents, their parents, their parents. And so you have kind of a direct two-way of multiple entities that you could consider one, but this is why we have the idea of self, right? Which is absolutely necessary, because if we didn't have self, like we were just the source consciousness, you can imagine like a hive mind, right? Like ants, like bees, we talked about in the last podcast episode. there would be building, but there wouldn't be growth, because growth takes perspective, right? At least in a human sense, the answers that we look for take perspective. That's why when you are taking psychedelics and you're, wanting to treat some form of addiction or some sort, you're finding the answers that already exist, but these answers work for you because of your area of perspective, right? These are definitive ideas. However, the answer only comes from your perspective, and that's why we use scientific method and things to generate information.
Let me interject real quick and just make sure that I understand a couple things. And the first thing that I'm hearing is that you don't believe that we're born blank slates.
No.
You believe that the experience of at least a couple generations, if not all the generations that have traveled through our DNA, that they are part of what makes us who we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that and what you said was that that's part of our subconscious.
Correct.
That's part of the way that we're going to interact with the world based on this kind of primal knowledge that's carried in the DNA, that through some type of biofeedback with the environment, as our generations learned how to interact with the world, that becomes part of our self-conscious.
Exactly, yes.
I'm a big fan of that. I think nature, and people used to ask the question all the time, nature or nurture, which one is what created us? And I personally think it's both. I think I would agree with you. I don't know how wholeheartedly, but I definitely agree that that primordial knowledge, that intelligence that we carry in our DNA does make up, and it does make up part of who we are, not only in our physical and biological manifestations, but also in our psychology, in our mental makeup, our intelligence, the way that we maybe we have aptitudes because of the skills or the lives that they lived. Now, at the same time, I do believe nurture's there, and I believe that a lot of my subconscious, I would also include some conscious as being heavily affected by the first 5-ish years of our life, and that really can set a foundation. Now, our DNA can respond to that, and our DNA makes up part of our response to that. But I guess I wanted to, one, clarify what you were meaning there, and two, to kind of add in the idea that there is a nature nurture, there is a biofeedback, and it's interesting that you mentioned that in the kind of context of God. And so what we're going to call God. I'm not talking about a Christian God. I'm not talking about the
Right.
Abrahamic God. I'm talking about, how do you define God?
I define God as the portion of consciousness that connects all people with sentient consciousness.
So source consciousness.
Yes.
So in a way, God is consciousness for you.
Correct. I want to bounce back really quick to the nature nurture.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to clearly represent a little bit. So yeah. I don't think that nature is actually a large part of who you become. Now, I think that your starting point is all from nature. Now, obviously, that's the reason that we have sentience. We have to create our own experiences, and then the experiences that we experience create the blueprint for our children. Now, I don't even necessarily believe that that's a genetic thing, like I told you. I don't totally believe in a whole lot of genetic theories, at least as influential as they claim to be. I don't think that necessarily if both of your parents are bipolar at birth, that you have a genetic aptitude for bipolar disorder, especially in mental disorders. I believe that we are very, very, very wrong in diagnosis and treatment, because, like you said, I think that it all stems from your very early years. You're talking about a period of time where your brain is acting in theta. This is the same period of time. This is the same state that you're in when you wake up in the morning, and it goes for young people. Theta is a way of reprogramming your subconscious. Now, I don't believe that it erases anything. The reason that I think that we are able to operate on theta to begin with is so that we can use, you have to break it down into multiple entities, right? So we talk about the waking consciousness, the sleeping consciousness, source consciousness, right? Well, in between those two, sleeping and waking, or waking and sleeping consciousness, you have a kind of filter, a partition. And to be able to pass information between the two, I believe, given the research that I've seen, that theta is the only way to deliver information from the waking conscious to the sleeping consciousness. And so that is why, and that is where mental health disorders manifest. Now, it could be partially from a linear line, almost genetic, but I wouldn't say genetic. I think that it is something that you are born with. It would be similar to genetics, and for people who can't totally understand what I'm saying, you can call it genetic. From your parents, you have a blueprint of your sleeping consciousness, right? This is what you're born with. It's almost no information minus your very, very programmed instincts, right? And so theta is the only way for your waking conscious to deliver back information. Now, I don't believe that you can erase any information from subconsciousness. You might not be able to think about it, but it's still there. 100% it's still there, because this piece of consciousness, and my idea is being protected or being almost backed up. If you could think of it like a computer, there's always going to be a main bank that delivers information, and so it would hold the information for your subconscious. Your subconscious doesn't necessarily hold anything. Your subconscious is the partition between your waking consciousness and the source consciousness. And so in nurture, I absolutely believe that is obviously shaping your subconsciousness. And because at up to 5 years old or so, you're in theta. So everything that you're hearing is directly programming your subconsciousness. Now, obviously, in the morning, most human beings are in theta, and while you sleep, you're in theta, so you're also being programmed then. And so that is how your waking consciousness is able to program your subconsciousness. And so I definitely don't believe that you're stuck in any state, right? You're never one thing and that's it. I don't believe that a human being can be classified as even their form of consciousness as one thing for its entirety. I think that if you're an extreme heroin addict, and you've murdered multiple people and you're in prison for 30 life sentences, I don't believe that there isn't a path to change. And definitively, it's hard to know. However, you see this often almost. People in incarceration for many years, and obviously some don't change, but people who find their beliefs and understand their idea of morality, they change, right? Heroin addicts get clean. People stop smoking cigarettes. And this isn't because, they overcame, I guess they overcame a trial. However, this isn't because they deleted a part of themselves that was addicted. They went through a trial similar to pilgrimage. I believe that, at least to make a great man, a great human, pilgrimage and suffrage is the key to creating superior moral individuals.
I'm going to just rephrase that in the way that I can interpret it, is that it sharpens your steel. Suffering helps you see reality, helps you appreciate reality, and helps you take responsibility, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And that would go, kind of that adage Joe Rogan has said, I know I've heard it through him that strong men make weak times make weak men make. No, I'm saying it wrong.
Strong men make
Strong men make easy times.
Easy times
make weak men. Weak men make hard times.
Hard times make strong men.
Hard times make strong men. And so I'm gonna go back to this subconscious, because I feel like we really have some nice meaty material in there, and this idea of nature versus nurture, and how the nature of us, that DNA is coming through us, and how that forms our subconscious, compared to what I'm looking at is the first 5-ish or so years. Now, you're using terms like theta consciousness, and I don't quite understand those, so I'm not going to use that terminology, but I guess maybe this is part of where I get to understand it. So I can understand that there's a waking consciousness, right? I'm conscious right now. I'm awake. And overall sober, without any kind of influence. I've got some sugar in me, a little bit of THC, but overall I'm awake. I'm aware of what's going on. I'm aware that I'm sitting down with you and you have a name and I know who your mama is and all that jazz. And then there's the sleep consciousness. And you're saying that that's a consciousness that I've put my awake consciousness is on temporary hold, but I'm still there. I'm still conscious. My brain is still working. And part of my understanding of what happens in the brain is during sleep, there's reconciliation, rewiring, creating neural pathways, whatever. And I might see those in dreams, and depending on frequency and what I eat and drink and things like that. For me, part of my understanding is that part of that process is, as you say, information isn't going away. The memories don't go away, but they're getting stored. And in some ways, I think, depending on the person, sometimes what's happening when we sleep, even me at my age, right? I'm taking in this information and I'm putting it into my subconscious, because I'm not going to keep it at full awareness. I can't keep everything up at the forefront, unless I utilize something that can bridge that gap. Now, that's not the same bridge you're talking about, because you're also talking about a supreme or a source consciousness. And one thing that you said is that sleep consciousness is the bridge between the two. That's where I wanted to go. Thanks for listening to me work this out.
Absolutely.
So if this is the bridge in our sleep consciousness, what is happening? So I just described what I think is happening, where it's kind of reconciling information, compartmentalizing, maybe it's putting it, it's like taking it from a large format and into a smaller format, and then putting it into the hard drive, into the the save files, right? But this isn't, and some of that's going to be used while I'm awake, but I may not be aware of it. But I'm going to tap into it throughout my day. So help me understand more of this bridge between the source while I'm sleeping. What is the connection there that is not in the connection in my waking consciousness?
Okay, I can break it down really, really well, because I feel like a lot of my theology has developed from me becoming a software engineer. A lot of it, the compartmentalization of information, I feel like, so man created computer as a way of storing ideas. I forget who said it, but there's a famous philosopher who's quoted as saying, the human mind is not built to store memories, it is built to create ideas. This is why people change so quickly. You develop ideas, and as you focus and develop those ideas over years, then you change as a person, because your waking consciousness has been reconstructed, right? You are no longer, well, your subconscious more of, is being reconstructed because the information that you're delivering is no longer the same information that you were delivering before. And so over time, as you're updating that, it changes. So the analogy that I'll use is source consciousness is like an internet, right? How is for instance, a web application delivered to the internet? The internet anything that is on the internet can be found from another user. However, there is an interface between the application and the internet, right? And so the internet would be source consciousness. This is the compiled information of all lives lived. And while the internet can change and things can be taken off, but let's just say, for example, that this cannot. This information is always available, and through certain experiences can get tapped in, right? You have to have direct lines from this to this. Now, the way that's done is from another entity in the middle. This is like your cloud services. This is what runs the computing for the internet as we know it, and you are delivering on a regular basis from the web application, which in this case would be you, to those servers. Those servers filter out, they change, they deliver, right? In this case, a lot of the time, this is where information is stored, but let's just assume that instead of storing it, this is the source consciousness stores it, this is just the delivery method, right? And so to interact with those things, you have to have certain, I like your use of neural pathways, right? We think of neural pathways as, the kind of structure of the brain. To kind of delve into it a little bit more, when you are thinking of a system, when you're developing knowledge of a system and you're learning, let's say, you're wanting to break down the way that the system works, you aren't learning from English. English isn't the way that you're constructing and remembering it, especially in web development. You're not learning based on what people are telling you. People use different definitions for different words all the time, very interchangeably almost. In the same sentence, they'll use two different words to describe one thing. It's because what you're doing is you are directly interfacing with a secondary part of your brain in the idea of the computer, because your phone stores information of your brain. When you're on your phone, you are thinking constantly. And so it is a almost mechanical blueprint, let's say. You are creating systems in there that you understand, right? But when we use our brain to understand those systems, our brain is constructing out of neural pathways that information, right? We're constructing a system of ideas, of compartmentalized information, the way that we can understand it, right? And so it goes to the idea of software engineering for me. If you are never using one outlet to one neural pathway to understand one specific thing that you care about in the source consciousness, if you haven't developed that, it won't work, right? So for me, I attempted psychedelic use whenever I was probably about 3-4 years ago now. I went on an entire shamanistic journey. I tried DMT, LSD, psilocybin, a few other things. It was a very large interest of mine on a mental level, right? Very interesting to me. And so I kind of developed these ideas through that idea of psychedelic pilgrimage. It was my search for answers in the way that I could understand them, because what I say isn't going to necessarily mean the same thing in English as what you believe. However, I can relate through my observation of the idea to what you believe, right? So this is why I break it down in source consciousness, because I know a lot of people, the idea of God is almost scary. It's almost if there is a sentient being that is making all decisions, then we have someone to blame now. We have someone to fear now, right? And so to an extent, source consciousness is going to make decisions on a conscious-wide level, right? Like in the West, we believe certain ideology, and most of the West would consistently believe that as well. Like murder is wrong, right? That is a ideology that our consciousness would have developed over years and years and years of generations of people that decided that this isn't something that we need to do. But just like riding a bike, right? you basically remember how to ride a bike. But a person who rides a bike more often is going to ride a bike better than you, right? Like a speed biker or whatever, race bike. And so I guess what I'm getting at is, this is why some people have an extreme connection to source consciousness and can really change their outlook and almost generate the life that they want, because they have whether they know it or not, a stronger connection because of the practices in their life. So let's assume the thing that you want to do is start a business. If the only thing that you focus on is starting a business for 10 years and this is your life, everything that you consume, and I don't mean, you think about it for 10 years, but you are actively developing new systems of understanding to understand how this is going to work, right? You're going to construct an idea of the way that you believe the commerce system works, our economy works, and it's going to be your version of such. It has to somehow mirror the way that it actually works so that it can work, right? But it's never going to be exactly, right? Somebody's idea of economy is very different than my idea of economy. Whether it's similar or not, still has extreme differences as well. And this is a good example. My aunt Alicia, she has started a credit app, right? She's a credit counselor, and so she developed an application with my old company, and she has a system that she believes is very, very, very similar. It gets very similar results to how credit is, the algorithm at which your credit is calculated, right? We don't know what that algorithm is. No one actually knows what the algorithm is, and there is a definitive algorithm that they use to run every scenario that you've been in, from an economic standpoint mostly, through this system to give you a ratio, right? She has mirrored what she thinks is the closest version of it, and that is her now proprietary software. It's a algorithm that mirrors extreme similarities of the actual algorithm used to calculate credit, right? But it's not the same one. It'll never be the same one because variables are there's so many variables. And I guess the point that I'm trying to get in is everybody's connection to source consciousness is even going to be different because of the way that they've constructed it. Through the things that you feel you need, the answers that you feel you need, the parts of you that you've developed are what make you different, which is why your connection to source consciousness is different. Because the things that you focus on, the things that you practice regularly, are the things of which the information can be passed. If you don't have a port, let's say, like a gateway for those pieces of information to be traveling.
So are you saying that we're all connected to the source consciousness, whether we're aware of it or not?
Oh, absolutely.
And are you saying, like, because one of the part of my question is that it seems like you're saying that there's this bridge in our sleep consciousness to the source consciousness, but then you're introducing psychedelics and you're saying this is another bridge.
Well, psychedelics enhance so I think any substance that you can put into your body, even food, directly, we just don't notice, and it's not something that we directly can, I guess we could, but we don't focus on finding definitive answers. We understand that eating certain things are healthier for you than others, and other things give you other things, right? And so the trade-off with like soda is that it's extremely bad for your body. However, the caffeine is the trade-off. You're trading health for the energy or the focus or whatever. And so I don't believe that it's a bridge to, I don't believe it's necessarily a bridge. However, it is amplifying a certain portion of your sleeping conscious, right? And so you can overdevelop those, right? Like in DMT, my DMT experience way reshaped the way that I think about things, and it was almost insane because it's the only time that I've actually had like almost a vision, because when you take DMT, you almost enter a sleeping state. And so I'm not saying that DMT took me there. I'm saying that DMT amplified my sleeping consciousness, my connection. It amplified my connection and bypassed my personal experience, my personal reality experience, what we call reality, right? My physical experience. It bypassed my complete physical experience.
And are you saying that because your awakened consciousness was in tune or communing with source consciousness without the sleep?
Well, I'm saying that you transfer from your waking consciousness to your subconscious in almost amplified in the fact that normally your sleeping consciousness, you aren't necessarily controlling. You aren't necessarily thinking of it as a first person point of view. So possibly it's amplifying a bridge of your subconscious that allows a piece of you to follow suit. But you lose even you gain the point of view of your subconsciousness. So you're not, this is why you don't see yourself as a body. This is like your astral projection, right? This is what people believe is similar to astral projection. They relate DMT, the trip that you have, to astral projection. And so I feel like there's a funnel, right? You have all these funnels that kind of change the information, and certain information is allowed through, certain information isn't. So there's a small, hair-thin bit of information that we get from our subconscious that we can, deliver back and forth between our subconscious and such. What I'm saying is that certain substances will amplify other certain hairline connections between those things. So DMT might amplify 20 of the, infinite amounts of strands that we have to our subconscious. And those are what our brain is delivering energy to, right? This is almost like we're shutting down everything else that it's not using. It's almost a sleeping state that your body goes into during DMT specifically. And so you're only delivering all of the energy within your brain. So you could even say the 10% of your brain kind of thing. Only 10% of your brain is activated during certain actions. However, you use 100% of your brain during the day. But you're only delivering energy to the things that you need to deliver energy to while you're doing those things, right? The things that are being active in the experiences that you're having currently. Mm-hmm. So now we are decreasing the experience even further, at least to a physical stand, even further to a totally subconscious experience, and delivering all of the energy that we would have used for this thing, and all things, I guess, to this one specific area. And so we're amplifying it, if that makes sense.
Would you relate that experience in DMT similar to how maybe a Buddhist would relate to enlightenment?
Absolutely. What I told my wife after my experience, I don't believe that there's one definitive answer, because you can't relate that through any kind of human communication, right? Now, I like the everything is one. Everything creates one whole, right? I like that idea because...
You're using my equation?
Yeah. From the last episode. Mm-hmm. So I like that because every answer that you're going to get, every answer that I'm going to get, like let's say you have, you're a heroin addict, right? And so the answer for you as a heroin addict to overcome your trial currently is still the same answer that everyone needs. It is just now put into a certain format to relate, because our brains, this is another thing that we touched on, me and my friend. He said, what about the signs that you get from God? Like, those are undeniable. And I said, well, yeah, there are absolute signs of the existence of a higher consciousness, higher power. However, us being able to recognize those signs are our connection to such, right? Because that thing is in reality almost all the time. It could be a street sign that you read. But it now being there in that specific point and you seeing it as a sign means that it is an absolute sign, right? It's your interpretation of the information. And so what I mean is, what I told my wife is that if you needed an answer, if you were lost, you were depressed, you wanted to commit suicide, you wanted to quit smoking, you wanted to quit doing heroin, you wanted to, whatever it is, you get your answer, because it is just one answer. It just filters down into it's the answer to your personal problem, the perspective of your problem. However, it would answer any question. This is the information is already there, right? There's no questions that need to be asked. We formulate questions based on perspective. And so the way that we receive answers is in our interpretation of those answers.
Now, for me, I've only done mushrooms a couple times, and I think the acid that I've done is strychnine. Excuse me, in this cough. When I did mushrooms, there were no questions or answers. When I did mushrooms, it was just euphoric. I was just in a completely euphoric state. I wasn't worried about who, what, when, where, why of anything. I was just experiencing on a very loving, compassionate, euphoric, free state, mental state. The other times that I've done, like, that's the only time that I had like a completely euphoric experience on the mushrooms. I've done mushrooms other times, and they really didn't have a super big effect on me, maybe give me the giggles or whatever, but nothing to that euphoric extent. And then I didn't go on any fantastic trips. Now, I have been on a fantastic trip, and I don't know what the genesis of that trip was. It lasted for a couple months, and I had my walk with God. Now, you know, I'm a heavy marijuana smoker, so a lot of people would say, you know, after years and years and years of marijuana use, there's always a possibility, I guess, of some of these psychedelics that they're stored in cells, and that, you know, I could have been reinvigorated by a previous trip. And I don't think that everybody gets the same answers. I don't think everybody has the same questions. I think that we're all like kaleidoscopes, and the light is filtered through who we are and how we see the world. And so if I'm born in a Hindu context, then I'm going to use Hindu symbols and Hindu languages to understand the experience of what I think what you're saying is that in these moments that you're connected to source consciousness, that you and source consciousness, your consciousness and source consciousness are one. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
And so what I understand you to say is that one of the ways that you can get at that is through sleep.
Absolutely.
One of the ways you can get at that is through the use of psychedelics.
Absolutely.
And then I'm going to go on that there are a lot of religious zealots or gurus or monks that will use a variety of ways to try to attain that.
All are considered what I would consider pilgrimage, right? Like a Buddhist monk is going to sit on a mountain with no idea of self. This is something that Bruce Lee even practices. There is no self, and that is denying yourself the ability to have a personal experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I absolutely believe that's the case. That's their
and
personal
so if
pilgrimage.
For me, one of the challenges of my experience where I interpreted my experience to be that I was united in communing with what you're calling the source consciousness. And what I recognized is that, wow, if we were all at that level of consciousness, how great the world would be. Because I do think that if we were at that level of consciousness, the amount of suffering that we implement upon each other would be lessened greatly. Because I think when we're in that consciousness, we realize what we're doing when we're creating karma or suffering for ourselves or for others. I think our awareness of that, I think that in this waking consciousness, our egos are a little bit more selfish. And so we're not concerned with some of the karma and some of the suffering we may be creating by our choices and our actions. I also felt that it would be really nice to live in that consciousness on a full-time basis. I cannot say that I've done that. Since my experience, I've studied Buddhism on my own. I earned a degree in Christian studies, a bachelor's degree, and I spent some years in a very liberal Christian seminary. And while there are many practices that people will tell you of the practices that other people did to get this, you also realize that a lot of these people never got there. They didn't even get there the one time, right?
Right.
They're still working off belief instead of knowledge, whereas you and I interpret what our experience is a knowledge. We know this. We know this. May not be able to put it into words, but I've been face to face with source consciousness. I've had my walk with God or whatever, right? I've sat under the Bodhi tree. Maybe I'm Buddhist, and now I feel like there are a couple examples of people that kind of live up there, at least in kind of religious. In those two, and specifically, one of those people would be Jesus, and the other person, in my understanding, would be the Buddha. Or shall I say the Christ and the Buddha, or Jesus and Siddhartha. And so, if the Buddha Christ consciousness, right, is this high level of attained consciousness, then are we able to get there and sustain it at a full-time, everyday level? Now, I believe it's possible, but I might not be able to do it myself. I may be limited. I've reconciled that maybe all I got was my glimpse on the mountaintop, and that's enough for me, because some people don't get that at all. And to expect that, God is going to favor me in some way and and say, now you have it, right? When I think of the ways that people get there, I will tell people I cheat. I smoke marijuana. It doesn't take me there all the time, but it gets me a lot closer.
Right.
And I experience the sensation of being in that space more, right? The other challenging part is there's a fine line between being there and being crazy. I see a bird fly in front of me, and most people are going to go, oh, look, it's a bird flying. Whereas I could be in this high level of consciousness, and that bird is giving me a message. By the trajectory of its flight, by the type of bird, by the timing of when I saw it, blah, 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 blah. This is the universe talking to me, right? The universe, in my opinion, can and does talk to us at every moment. Every moment. Everything that is happening is like a four-way conversation. It's the conversation between me and you. It's a conversation between me and the world. It's a conversation between me and God. And this is God talking to us at the same time, right? And so I guess I'm just thinking out loud here and kind of relating to some of the things you said and recognizing that this level of consciousness that you've used psychedelics to reach and other people have used other methods to reach, and I would refer to my use of THC as cheating.
Me as well. This is the idea of unearned knowledge, right?
So then here's part of my question for myself and for you. Because we're cheating, because we're using augments, we're using crutches, how can we know that what we're experiencing is real and not just an effect of the drugs and or psychosis?
Well, it depends on what you believe. Like I said, I don't believe in this idea of psychosis as the way that we understand it. I think psychosis is the rejection of agreed upon ideology for the most part. I think that bipolar manifests usually in the inability to express manic energy because that's frowned upon. I believe that ADHD is of the same thing. I believe that depression is of a similar thing. I think that anxiety is of a similar thing. It's our rejection of the ability to express a certain part of ourselves. And so when we get to express our sadness, it manifests in a deeper sadness, such as depression, something that our subconscious is longing now. So in the case of psychosis, there's a very, very, very thin line that you walk on psychosis and genius.
So
right?
so let me. You see a homeless person, right? Because this is not a super uncommon thing to do if you're out in the streets. And that person comes up and they say, "Look, I got a message from God for you," and they start going off. And maybe they're a little bit intoxicated. Maybe they're just intoxicated with passion. But they're a little bit off their rocker, right? Do you believe that they're in that is psychosis, or do you believe that they're in communion with God?
I don't believe either is true. I believe that your interpretation of what someone says is absolutely I believe it's source consciousness. I believe that if you don't believe that it applies to you, then that's because you have a poor interpretation of your connection to source consciousness.
But there's a difference between believing and knowing, right? I asked you that earlier.
Right.
There's a difference in someone coming up and saying, "I believe Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior,"
Right.
and someone coming up and saying, "I know that I've met God,
Right.
that I've been in communion with God."
Correct. Yeah. The belief is the faith in the idea that something will be presented as inevitably true. Whereas knowing is that you have been given the presentation of truth. Now, there's obviously, it depends on what applies to your circumstances. If if someone has just recently died and it was a very traumatic experience and it's holding you back from a lot, and this homeless person were to come up and say something about someone that you've lost, then obviously you're going to take that to heart, and you're going to see that is very, very, very almost obvious that this is a sign of the source consciousness telling you that you need to move on, that this isn't what you're destined for, right? But if it's something that is a little bit more divisive, something that is a little bit more abstract, then you may not be able to apply that to yourself, right? But I think the idea is that source consciousness makes up all of our consciousness. I think that there's an idea to be had where you could say that source consciousness has developed these compartmentalizations of consciousness so that it can trick itself into believing that it's not the only thing that exists, right? And so I don't believe that if a person comes up and says that God has a message for them, then they feel that they were given by source consciousness the tools at which to deliver a message to you, whether you know that you need it or not. I believe, like you said, the source consciousness or God would be talking all the time. The bird is a message. It's whatever you interpret as the message. Like, the message is all the same thing. The message is always the same thing. But the way that a human being interprets it is what creates the difference. And so the way that we interpret psychosis, that's our ideologic construct of what we're trying to say is wrong with a person. But if a human being is living, breathing, is consciously formulating thoughts or subconsciously formulating thoughts, or not even of their own consciousness, there isn't a real insane. This isn't like something that you're endowed with, right? This isn't something that you can never break of. This is a state of consciousness that exists. It's a state of consciousness that is manifested within the realm of reality. It's not, I don't believe that there's anything wrong with someone. Now, they can do things that are wrong, that I believe are moralistically wrong, and I believe that the idea of moral comes from the energy that you put into each experience, and so that can be related to a negative or positive experience. But I think if you're fueling your car and you're an old woman who's going, and she's a nurse, and you're going to work in a nursing home, right? And you're fueling up your car, you drive all the way there, and some will say, well, you polluting the air is a terrible act that's immoral. However, this old lady, she didn't put any negative energy into polluting the sky. This is something that she's doing almost habitually. This isn't something that she had to think about. So moralistically, to me, the only thing that moral has to do with anything, good and evil, negative, positive, is the energy that you decide to put into that thing, right? I don't necessarily care to label, insanity or sanity, or say that some version of consciousness is a better form of consciousness. Now, it might manifest in a way that, you would rather have, and then you create that consciousness. You develop that form of your consciousness.
I can't quite co-sign on that, because just because somebody is molesting a little girl and because he doesn't have any negative energy on it, because he doesn't think that that's wrong, that doesn't make it wrong.
I don't necessarily believe that. I mean, I think that there is negative energy.
Like the fact that the woman's putting gas in her car and she's burning greenhouse gases or whatever, and I don't really want to get into all that because it's diluted or whatever, but the idea that because she doesn't have any negative energy on it, therefore it doesn't have any negative karma or negative consequences for her or the planet. Just because you don't think it's wrong doesn't mean it's not wrong. And we can
this is more what I'll dive in a little bit more.
Well, because I don't want to get too far off on the moralistic thing, because I really want to stick with this idea of the difference between knowing and believing, and how that's perceived in our consciousness, and that connection to source consciousness.
Right. So let me just wrap up my idea before it's misrepresented. The idea that I hold isn't that what she did may have been wrong. However, the nature of the decision she made wasn't wrong. Now, this is something that eventually we will grow to know, right? This is something that subconsciously we will know that this is a terrible way to live and we don't want to pollute the skies. Now, we are in a generation of that turning point, right? However, labeling that specific person, that manifestation of consciousness, as bad for making that decision is wrong. Now, that's she didn't make an immoral decision. Now, I'm not saying that a person who tries to molest a child isn't because they think it's right or because they disagree. We are built on those principles, right? Our humanity, our ideology is built, our subconscious is built on on specific principles, probably that were formed at the same time that we decided murder was wrong, molestation, rape, those things are wrong.
But at one time we totally saw slavery as an acceptable way for the world to work.
Absolutely.
That doesn't
just
mean
like I wouldn't say,
just because we believed it was right, just because that's what everybody was doing doesn't make. That's my point.
Right? No, I agree. She's not doing the right thing, but she's not making an immoral decision, is what I'm saying. She's not an evil person for doing this because our consciousness hasn't decided definitively that is the way that we want to move, right? So through generations and generations, every generation forward would be ingrained with that belief, just like we're ingrained with the belief that murder is bad. Now, what I'm getting at is that you can make immoral decisions, but I'm saying that isn't an immoral decision if you're not putting direct negative energy into it, right? So you can justify murder any way that you want, but because our consciousness collectively agreed that murder is bad, we still hold murder bad. And to even go further, for some, there is justification of murder, right? And to play devil's advocate, that is the perspective, right? That is our human perspective. And so, as you said earlier, if we could all be at that higher state of consciousness, right? That is our direct line to source consciousness, as I believe. And so you already see that manifest in other forms of consciousness, such as ants, right? That's called hive mind, right? And so you have to play devil's advocate. Would we rather be a hive mind, or would we rather exist the way that we exist now? And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. I think that bad things happen because it's part of the system, part of the universe.
Well, I think that goes to, and I'm going to bring this back to source consciousness, and I think that human consciousness likes to judge things and classify things and label things and make judgments about it. And I'm not sure that source consciousness has that same sense of judgment.
No, absolutely not.
And so, what we label as bad or good and evil, I think most people would be surprised to find out that God is not a human and is not limited by five senses and is not limited by the intelligence that we have.
Not limited by perspective.
And not limited by perspective. And so, that I'm glad you said perspective, because again, it goes back to, there are people that will say, well, this is okay. And then there are other people say this is not okay.
And they can
both be
over perspective.
Yeah, but I mean, depending on where they come from, maybe it's a cultural thing, right? Like,
exactly.
I think it's kind of gross to eat an egg that has a half-formed chicken in it. But in some cultures, that's a delicacy.
Right.
I think that there are some cultures that have done things for a long time in their culture, and then we get 2,000 years away from them, and we look at them, and we're like, oh, that was so evil. How could they do that? I don't think that the human perspective of this binary 1-0, good, bad, positive, negative, and especially with the limits that we have on our senses and the limits we have through our intelligence / our ignorance. I think without being in that space of connected to source consciousness, that we're all just really running around blind. Some of us have more awareness than others, but unless you're completely the Buddha and you're completely in that state of consciousness 24 hours for the rest of your life, you're going to make decisions for survival, whether it's putting gas in the car and driving it, that are going to create karmic effects, whether or not you believe they're good or bad, I don't care what energy you put on it, personally, what kind of psychic energy or whatever, ultimately there's a cost to be paid. There's action, there's reaction, there's choices, and there's consequences. And so, for instance, slavery had been around for a long time, before 1492. It'd been around for all over the world in many different contexts. In the United States, we focused on the African slave trade because it was very apparent to us, and because our history is deeply entwined with an end of slavery, with the end of the idea that it's socially and morally acceptable, right? Because at one time it was completely, the Bible will say it's okay, right? Slaves, obey your masters type shit, right? So from a moral standpoint, again, this is a human judgment of what's right and wrong. This doesn't say, that's why I have trouble with the Bible, because I think it's written by men from a man's perspective. Maybe it was inspired by God, but I've been inspired by God too, and I know it's really hard to put into words what I experienced. I struggle with the same thing for Muhammad. All blessings and proper respect to Muhammad and the Islamic faith, but at the same time, he's a mere human, and maybe he was inspired to write this book, but I know that men are fallible, we're not complete, we are limited, and as much as he wanted to try to share his experience with us through the Quran, he is still human, and it still gets filtered through his prism, through his kaleidoscope.
I think what's interesting about that is that's actually the Islamic difference, so to speak, between Christianity, is that they believe that Jesus is a single, he is one of many prophets of God. He's not a godly being. They are humble in their nature of God-fearing, for example. It's really interesting to think about, because that's exactly how they portray it, is that their beliefs are the best way that they can culturally construct the way to live, based on the experience of someone who's writing the Quran. I'm not sure exactly how the Quran is constructed. It's probably of multiple stories of, whatever. But yeah, that's an actual. Islam is actually one of my favorite of the Abrahamic religions for that aspect. They believe in the humility of man, the incomplete nature of man, and yeah, I love that idea because you can practice to be something as close to God as you can, but in reality, you still have perspective. You don't have omniscience, right?
Yeah, and that's what when I say getting tapped into that source, you know, I believe that it's part of our evolution, that we are evolving into what will one day be enlightened sentient beings. I could be wrong. We could be machines in 100 years, and I don't know how that fits into my theory. And you know, machines add a whole nother layer to the information storage and capabilities. And
I think that's where we diverge, right? Our consciousness diverges. I think that we will have a layer of the earth, human beings that defer back to the humility of a living organism, and then we have pieces of consciousness that were of human origin that are constructed so that they believe that they are the only thing that exists, so that they can then themselves become a god. They construct their own universe, and through computer technology, I believe that is. I believe that's the future of if we continue with AI and intelligent storing and things of that nature.
Can AI tap into source consciousness?
No, AI is quite literally our way of trying to create a form of sentient consciousness, right? Like that is our way of trying to recreate the human mind. And it's always going to be limited because it is of us, which means that it is even more limited than us. Now, if you found a way to, I think eventually we'll have things that are advanced enough to map a pretty similar version of a human mind and consciousness. I don't think that it'll ever be you. So if you created a computer that you know, the idea that you can be put into a computer, I don't believe is the case. Now you can map and send very, very similar electrical frequencies that would have happened at certain periods of time to create a version of you that is very, very, very similar, like we talked about with the algorithm for Alicia and whatnot, that is extremely similar, almost maybe even undeniably, we couldn't definitively tell a difference, right, of how the brain calculates and works, but still won't be human.
So if the AI sends you a message because you're scrolling through Facebook and the AI sends you a message and it's going to look and feel very similar to the bird flying in a direction.
Right.
Is that source consciousness or is that AI consciousness? And how do you know the difference? And, sorry, I want to ask another question. The closer we get to reliance on AI and computers for our information, are we getting farther away from source consciousness?
I definitely believe that we are definitely moving away from source consciousness. I don't believe that we are getting any closer to enlightenment. I believe that we are slowly constructing ideas and things that we believe to be true so that we can feel safe in our existence apart from source consciousness. You can think of it like water on Earth, right? There's only so much water on Earth. So we can either take what we have and create something new, or we just run out of it. And so obviously the very first person endowed with consciousness would have had the highest level of consciousness. They are the one, right? And so every single time that is multiplied, we are actually dividing the amount of source consciousness. And this is why everybody has a very small piece. Now, the way that we understand consciousness is that we have consciously moved forward in history, right? We've developed and become smarter, right? But the idea of intelligence is a personal, that's your waking consciousness. So in losing source consciousness, we are developing our own personal consciousness, right? And so if you wanted to, I guess, speak, the AI is constructed of the essence of source consciousness, but in more so of the way that your personal consciousness is now becoming the source of which consciousness is being derived. Obviously, that has remnants of source consciousness, but
Can the AI interpret and take in anything other than empirical evidence? I don't know this. I honestly don't know the answer to this.
yeah, no, it is absolutely empirical. They
So
can't
it's only
construct original ideas.
right. So it's only based on what can be seen, heard, observed. Right. It can only format its intelligence, its information, on those things. For one, that's the input that humans are giving it to start off with. Yeah. So, is the source consciousness, is that something that can be experienced through empirical evidence?
Absolutely not, because our idea of empirical evidence is perspective based. Like I said, there is one answer. We all get to share it, and we perceive it, or we break it down in a different way. The same guy in China who needs an answer for whatever question that he has to ask will get the exact same answer as the heroin addict under a bridge. It will just format differently. The one answer is interpreted differently based on perspective. And so there's nothing empirical about it. It is an energy of ambiguity.
So you say they get the same answers, but they both write it down. Let's say they don't write it down. Let's say like Jesus, his apostles tell the stories, and then people that know his apostles write it down. Let's say the same thing happens with Buddha. Buddha doesn't write anything down. It's his students or his students' students. And through that process, and we'll go up to Islam, we have Muhammad, who also claims to be enlightened, right? Would be this my understanding of what he's saying, that I've been in communion with the one, and therefore I'm enlightened, and I'm here to share this message. Now, they all get the same answer, and you say they all interpret it differently?
Yeah,
or is it that when they write it down, it gets interpreted differently? Because if they're all getting the same answers, then why are we 2,000, 5,000 years later so confused?
This is, I guess my analogy can change a little bit. Okay, so light and dark, okay? The answer to your specific question is going to be of the exact same essence of, let's use light. It is going to all be light, okay? But the way that we receive that and interpret it is going to be based on our perspective. So just like how you said, you see the bird as the sign, everybody else just sees it as a bird. Well, you interpreted that bird to be a sign because of your perspective of reality. You needed it to be a message, and so you interpret it as a message. Whether you know you need it or not, this is of the same essence of source consciousness in the fact that it is an answer for you because you believe that it's a message. And the only thing that makes a message of superior or source consciousness a message of superior or source consciousness is your ability to filter and interpret that information. Because source consciousness doesn't ask questions, there aren't questions to be asked, right? We're developing things that need definitive answers because of the way that we construct reality, but of source consciousness would not. It is just one thing. Source consciousness is just one thing. It is the whole, right? We divide it up, and we try to calculate, and we try to find empirical definitive evidence. In reality, there is no. If I told you that it was my job in my life to tell you that ketchup is red, right? Now, I will believe that I have given you a very important piece of empirical evidence, right? Now, whether you think of that as an important message or not is directly up to your interpretation. I believe solely that you needed to know that it was my job that the purpose of my existence was to tell you that ketchup is red, you don't have to believe that. There's nothing in you that empirically believes that. Now, my mission in saying that is of the same light of source consciousness that would be the message for anyone, right? It is of the same essence. What I mean is that there is only one answer because it is one whole piece of information, right? We filter it down to what we believe we can interpret through our perspective. Our perspective is these layers and layers and layers and layers of things that separate the information. So now, by the time you hear ketchup is red, whereas I might have thought that this was a divine idea, you've broken it down to ketchup is a condiment, and of course it's red because I can see red, right? However, that's the barrier of communication for us. What if to me, when I said ketchup is red, I meant something of I meant to enlighten you with that message because I interpreted my message of enlightenment to break down into that sentence, right? This is what I mean. We personally can believe right or wrong. We personally can believe in the meaning of something based on perspective. However, everything, like you said, is whole, right? Everything is one thing, right? Everything starts from one definitive aspect of reality, and it is of the essence of, in this case, we can even say life, right? Life is all of life, right? We are alive because we are of life. Mitochondria are alive because they are of life. Now, the way that we interpret those two things, we can call them different. We can break them down and classify them by their characteristics that we see physically, based on our five senses. However, breaking it down as far as you can only proves further and further that they are of life. They are of the same energy, essence, or the only thing that exists. It is of the whole, the source consciousness, the God.
I really have enjoyed this conversation, and it's actually cool to watch your mind unravel, and because we do share some of that DNA, for me, that's one of the proofs. That's one of the things that I notice is through like nephews and cousins and other family. Like, there are similarities, and they're not just physical perspectives, the way we look, and regardless of whether it's nature or nurture. I think that if you were born and had your mom decided to give you up for adoption, I think you still would have been a very similar person. And in that regard, I think that nature has a strong hold. I think the answers to God are one of the things that I enjoy discussing and that I enjoy chatting about, and that's one reason why I enjoy having conversations like these. For me, it's a journey, and everybody's on their own journey, and everybody's going to come to their own conclusions. I don't feel like I'm here to tell anybody whether they're right or wrong on their journey. I think that if I feel it's necessary to tell you that ketchup's red because that's going to help you on your journey, then I'm going to do so. But if you tell me you're colorblind and it doesn't really matter, then I'm going to say, okay, I get it.
Right.
If you tell me that you're blind altogether, then I'm going to say I get it, and maybe certain things aren't important to you in your journey. At the end of the day, I think it's very important to ask these questions and to have these discussions. I think anytime that one person tells you this is the definitive way, and I've got all the answers, and I talk to the gods, and here I am, I come back and I come to lead you, and here's this program that you have to follow. I think that those are dangerous people. I think the people that come and they say, this is how I'm doing it. This is how it worked for me. These are the choices I made, and these are the decisions I made. These are the things that affected it, and the positive and negatively in my experience. I think it's highly important because, as we pointed out in this podcast, we are becoming more reliant on machines. And we are getting distance. We are getting further and further away from the nature of ourselves. And I personally believe that nature of ourselves is the source consciousness. And that I can't speak for the universe and how it will choose to evolve us. I understand that many people feel that we have a lot of power to create and to shape these things. And I believe some people do. But I also believe that there are forces in motion that are so far beyond our human capability of understanding and appreciating and knowing right now, perceiving even, Like consider that, at one point we did not perceive cells. We didn't know what they were. We didn't know, you know what I mean? So we got microscopes. So before microscopes, that mitochondria, it was not empirically based evidence. There was nothing to prove that existed. Doesn't mean it didn't exist. Still existed. Quote unquote, we discovered America. No, we didn't. There was no discovery. We didn't create it. It was here. There were already people here, right? And so just because something's outside of our perspective doesn't mean that one, it's not real, and two, that it's not going to affect the reality.
Right.
And I think that's one of that's the wisdom that I take away. Is that I am not able to know everything. I may get glimpses, and maybe one day we will evolve into that, and maybe it'll take the help of computers. I don't know, but I think that'd be a good topic for another time. What do you say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, bro. Thanks for coming and hanging out.
For sure,
Everybody,
for sure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy this type of conversation, please like, share, subscribe, comment. Algorithm love is huge, and feel free to respond to some of the things that we've said in the comments. I'll be more than happy to share my opinions and to have some discussions. So until next time, this is Cousin Chet with Cousin Julian. Everybody have a great day. Peace.